I'm excited to be joined today by Daniel Beaudoin. He has worked in and lectured about negotiating humanitarian spaces in conflict zones for decades. He served in the Israeli Defense Forces as a liaison to international organizations such as UN agencies and the Red Cross, helping facilitate humanitarian operations, including safe routes for food distribution. And with all that expertise, I'm excited to dive into this conversation to break down the quote unquote controversy surrounding the Gaza Humanitarian Fund. So, Daniel, thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation. Let's go straight to the point of the headlines. The need for the GHF has been described by the US and Israel in order to bypass Hamas, which has historically diverted and looted aid throughout the past nearly 20 months, in order to get food directly to Gazans. In doing so, to the best of your knowledge, what are the operational difficulties that the IDF is facing to make this happen?
Well, the challenges are significant, of course. Something that gets lost, I think, in the overall narrative when we discuss the conflict in Gaza and the challenges to distributing humanitarian aid wherever the IDF is involved is that it is not a secure zone. For IDF to be able to do its work, not only from a combat situation, but also from a coordinating and facilitating, for example, the funds, the American funds distribution of aid in the Gaza Strip, it has to be able to do so without having Hamas terrorists popping up from the 500 kilometers of underground tunnels and attacking them. So this is a security predicament, a significant threat to how aid can be facilitated through the American fund in a safe and secure manner. So this is one issue that is of course of an existential nature for the people in the ground trying to help with the aid. Another issue which we've been hearing is that the fund itself is off to a slow start. It must be said that apparently the staff, this is what we're hearing, are not prepared enough to deal with coordinating humanitarian aid in a conflict zone. They do not have combat experience. They do not have weapons. They don't have rules of engagement. If they would have the weapons, quite a few of them I hear are above the age of 60, which is not a bad thing. I'm 60, but I mean, to have to actually be in the field in such a high pressure environment, it does take a certain amount of, I would say, operational readiness, and it seems that the fund is missing this. So I imagine that is an operational challenge that they will have to deal with in the future.
So, the headlines are constantly editorializing the initiative by qualifying it as the US Israel backed mission to make it seem like an isolated kind of initiative, and often with the word controversial attached to it. So, what, if anything, do you consider controversial about the GHF?
Well, I would say what is controversial about the GHF is calling it controversial. I think it feeds into part of a general narrative. What you call headlines, of course, is also something that is the result of a dominant, I would say, attitude towards the conflict in general and humanitarian aid distribution in the Gaza Strip in particular. It is the narrative of U.S. Israel led, I would say, impartial, discriminatory attitude towards relief to the Palestinians. The opposite is the case, actually, but this doesn't make it into the narrative. For example, the criticism that 2 million Gazans are being pushed into the south as if it were for no reason other than the IDF wanting to get rid of them. That's not the case. It is the attempt of the IDF to create humanitarian safe spaces where they can operate more freely in trying to combat Hamas's terrorist infrastructure without incurring significant collateral damage to the population. So this is this whole dilemma, this ethical dilemma of proportionate use of force, of indiscriminate use of force, forgets to mention the close quarters combat that takes place in the Gaza Strip, with almost every third house either being booby trapped, 500 kilometers of tunnels built with donor money under the Gaza Strip, and Hamas popping up all over the place. So I would say this does not make it into the narrative. The narrative is one-sided. I think what makes it controversial, or what lends it legitimacy in the eyes of the critics, when they say it is controversial, is also it's coming, I think, from a colonizing aspect. There is a buzz lately, and I'm aware of it in American campuses, especially. I think of, if the U.S. and Israel are involved in anything that has to do with wanting to provide aid, it must be some sort of colonial trick. You know, it must be some sort of white supremacy, colonial manipulation of reality. There must be ulterior motives to this issue. Um, by definition, the Israeli side is guilty. They cannot be victims, and the Palestinians are automatically victims because they are under the boot of the colonizer. And many NGOs and who advocate on behalf of the Palestinians use this narrative, and it has traction. It has traction, and the news networks pick up on it. Um, so I don't even think, it's a question of bad PR on the side of Israelis when Israel can't get its message across. I think it's a question of, even if we were to have the best PR in the world, I don't think there is something we can do to create some sort of, parity between the narratives. So it's very much a narrative story. Some media outlets are more, let's say, aware of this, and others are less. So this is very much a frustrating situation, for those of us that are on the receiving end of this criticism.
Yeah, certainly the aggressor and victim narrative is something that we are running up against on a daily basis. I want to go back to what you said, that we're seeing this pushback to the effort to significantly change the equation to cut out Hamas. And it would seem that the UN would prefer to keep the status quo. I have to mention the WFP is still handing out food. And I saw videos just a few days ago that aired on CBS of the trucks were under the protection of armed clans. So what do you make of that? I mean, would you see that these armed clans are another form of the same evil? What do you make of the fact that the UN would prefer to be under Hamas protection rather than to cooperate with the IDF?
I think there are quite a few reasons. I'll keep it to several, to two or three. Um, the UN's pushback on the humanitarian fund is, I would say, politically motivated. I The calls, for example, of um, uh, criticizing the fund, that they're not neutral, for example, that they are abating the situation, is is something that doesn't come as a surprise for me. Hamas has been present in the Gaza Strip for more than 2 decades. It cannot be possible. I see highly unlikely that the UN and UNRWA and other international aid efforts in the Gaza Strip were unaware of the fact that Hamas was arming itself and using the millions upon millions of money coming in from the UN, coming in from Europe, from the US, and from other countries, to build its infrastructure at the detriment of the Palestinian population, which it had to protect. when he came into power since 2007. This does not happen. So you have one of the most advanced terrorist infrastructures that history has seen. You have a population that is living in misery for decades, where humanitarian aid money is being siphoned off, aid is being siphoned off. And how how can nobody notice this? Where was the outrage over those last 20 years? So to suddenly, to suddenly come up and say, "Oh, there is an alternative to us," it shows me how much they feel threatened by someone coming in who may actually be neutral and impartial and not part of the naming and shaming and incrimination of Israel as the humanitarian aid agencies have done for the last 20 years. So the minute you take them out of the equation, they lose political leverage over the situation. And this political leverage usually is Israel is sabotaging the aid effort in the Gaza Strip, not just now, 20 years. And this is the reason why we need to be there. And this is the reason, for example, why we need to keep UNRWA um, in business, because as long as UNRWA is in business and the UN are in the field, we can leverage the Palestinian issue. We can leverage the fact that Israel is the usual culprit in sabotaging aid. When they say sabotaging aid, what they're meaning is erecting checkpoints, trying to screen the very real threat that comes out of Israel into the Gaza Strip. I'm not even into the south of Israel, out of the Gaza Strip. I'm not even talking about the thousands of rockets that have been fired from Hamas in the last 20 years onto the southern townships of Israel. So this dilemma that they find themselves in is is one that I welcome personally. I know maybe it's a biased view, but I think from my experience with the UN, to be at the receiving end of being called an open air prison, of being called a concentration camp, of being called all these years, not only now, of of the tense relations between the government of Israel and the UN, in particular UNRWA, and the fact that Hamas uses UNRWA schools and warehouses and as human shields and hospitals as human shields, attracting all the attention on Israel again. This is something that without UNRWA there and with the UN playing a much lesser part in the aid equation, I think can only serve the interests also of the Palestinian population, because in the end this political attitude of the UN, I think, hampers their ability to negotiate humanitarian access to the beneficiaries, the Palestinian beneficiaries. If there's a lack of trust between the hosting country and the UN agencies that are operating within the Gaza Strip, this may, and many times does, negatively affect the ability of these aid agencies to coordinate humanitarian space. So I think it'll be. I do agree that the humanitarian fund that was just established needs to step up its game. Okay, this is. I mean, it's it. Yes, 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 yes. I mean, from an operational standpoint, they need, and you know what? If it means talking to the UN agencies and trying to learn from them a little bit what could work or not work. I don't know how that will work because they're really seen as part of the enemy. But it's good to see the UN agencies suddenly scrambling for attention after they have hogged the public eye for so long and used it in order to lambast Israel. So I feel this could be a good step forward.
Well, what feels so off is, as you framed it, that they would be considered the enemy when at the end of the day, it's just trying to be a humanitarian effort. Why not strive for cooperation and continue to pose it as these lines that because it's Israeli backed, it must be somehow bad. I wanted to ask you because this week 170 charities and NGOs such as Oxfam and Save the Children and many others condemned the GHF and blamed it. There have been multiple reports of massacres. There's, no video proof that has come out of it, which is ironic given how everything in Gaza seems to be documented. Um, but the IDF has
Mhm.
acknowledged that there are operational incidents that are being investigated. Um, from your Can you give us an explanation of what are the norms of humanitarian work that they are referring to in their criticism? um, they say forcing 2 million people into overcrowded zones to receive the aid is the largest violation. um, do you think that that criticism is valid?
No, I don't think this criticism is valid. The humanitarian norms you're referring to, there are 7 or 8 of them, but I'll just mention the question that pops up all the time now, in criticism of the fund by the aid community in Gaza, is the lack of neutrality of this fund, meaning that they are part of the political equation. They are part of they are not they're part of the controversy. They are part of a political identification with the interests of Israel. All right, neutrality, or at least the ICRC definition of neutrality, is exactly that: not to be part of the political and ideological controversy. Okay, in order to have better access and not to be seen as a political agent, so that it'll be easier to talk to, easier to work with, and easier to coordinate with. But it's strange that this is coming from the UN, which, as I have explained earlier, is not impartial, not neutral. The UN uses the words neutrality and impartiality, borrowed from the ICRC platform, but do not, in effect, implement them. There is nothing impartial and neutral about about the UN. It is by definition political. It's what they do. So when they coordinate aid, they will criticize Israel, name and shame it, and try to achieve political capital by criticizing Israel. Now, who is funding UNRWA, for example, and why are they too big to fail? Arab, the Arab African bloc is funding UNRWA, pouring in millions and millions and millions of dollars, trying to keep the Palestinian issue alive. They're not interested in the well-being of the Palestinians. They need UNRWA there as a humanitarian fig leaf, in order to, under which they can, under the umbrella of the so-called neutrality and partiality principles, to operate effectively as a political agent. So it is strange that, coming from the UN, they will be calling the American-Israeli effort impartial or not neutral. Um,
Well, the halo effect for the UN is all too real. Um, so I wanted to zoom out for just a moment to end on actually the distribution of aid in Gaza. Do you think that there's any other equivalents in the current current conflicts in the world, Yemen with the Houthis, or any other? There's numerous other conflicts that are happening now. All of the media and world's attention seems to be focused on Gaza. Is it really such a unique case, or are there other places that we can compare it to?
you would think, by reading the news, that the only case in the world that deserves attention and this amount of focus by international fora and the media is the Gaza Strip. In Yemen, you have 20 million people um, in need of immediate aid. You have, I don't want to get the number wrong, for the good of the children themselves, you have 12 million children that are in immediate danger of starvation. When did you last hear about this? When did you last hear about the Congo, where there is mass rape on a daily basis? On a daily basis. When did you last hear about Darfur, about Sudan, about the other forgotten emergencies, right? So Israel receives an incredible amount of attention on these issues. Again, because I was involved intensively with the coordination of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip, I I often ask myself this myself, you know, how objective am I being when I say this, because after all, I spent thousands of hours dealing with this. I really think that the IDF does everything possible to mitigate, to the best of its operational facilities, the collateral damage to the Palestinian population. I think the steps, and even if you ask Colonel Kemp, a friend of Israel, was a NATO officer, in Afghanistan, and others, they will tell you this. But this doesn't make the headlines. What makes the headlines is the Israel issue. Again, I think it has a lot to do with the colonizer issue. I hope it doesn't have much to do with anti-Semitism. You know, I don't know. I hope it's, I hope it's something more banal than that. Something um, something as inconsequential as white supremacy, woke activism in campuses, all over the world, and not an undercurrent, which we are maybe not quite aware of, that there is really a concentrated effort here, to rain it down on us, on Israel, So I don't know. My mind isn't made up regarding that question.
I mean, I do see the connection to all being an effort to delegitimize Israel and the Israeli army. I think it's clear from recent statements and popular sentiments. So, uh,
Talia, sorry if I may, just,
absolutely.
but we don't help here very much, I must say, because when the media picks up, and we make life easy sometimes for the media, when the media picks up, for example, statements by Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich from the far right partners in the Likud Netanyahu-led coalition, that we need to, conquer all of Gaza, and we need to annihilate and destroy and stop humanitarian aid. This doesn't help Israel. Uh, I think those are fringe extremists that are having their infamous moments, in the lamplight. I hope, as far as I'm concerned, that, well, it's a political issue. Anyway, let's say they are a fringe voice, but a fringe voice that is amplified by the media. And in this sense, I don't think we make it very difficult for the media to find things said in Israel that could back up what they believe in the first place. So, I wish we were more careful with these statements.
Yeah, but we can also turn it back on the media that they are constantly picking up on every fringe or mainstream thing, and without they scrutinize every word that comes out of the Israeli government. Whereas there are very few questions asked of Hamas. There is very little scrutiny of the numbers that they put out or what's happening in there, and they can claim lack of access, reliance on locals, but it's really just an unwillingness to look deeper.
It's baffling. It's baffling how, after the massacre of the 7th of October and kidnapping more than 200 women, children, grandmothers, grandfathers, and still holding hostages in damp and dark, tortured places underground, that nobody inverts their attention to say, wait, hold on a second. Maybe we should be pressuring Hamas. Maybe we should be pressuring Qatar, that is the number one provider for Hamas over the years. Where is all of the political clout, the international political clout, to come to bear? It is as if Hamas is just a tourist. You know, they're in the background. They're not behaving very nicely. But maybe, well, what can you do? They're misbehaved children. It doesn't. I simply am amazed by this. But the lack of content. It's baffling. I mean, the onus of responsibility is on Israel and not on the terrorists that for 20 years have been shelling Israel and for 2.5 years holding hostages captive and torturing them. And no one's talking about this. How does that make sense?
Like your metaphor alluded to, the Israel is expected to be the adult in the room.
Yeah, I guess so.
But I want to thank you so much for your time. I want to end on the positive note that we hope to see the 50 hostages returned home soon. And I want to thank you so much for your time and for adding all this context into the headlines that we're seeing.
Thank you very much, Talia, and be good. It was nice seeing you again.